Good afternoon, Mr. Ahrendsen.
Good afternoon.
We'll let you get seated and comfortable, of course, and you can begin your remarks when you are ready.
Thank you. Many times in my life, I've been asked, Aaron, how do you know how to do that? I grew up on a small farm, and I had many different experiences and jobs on that farm. One that I remember is being able to drive tractor on the highway when I was extremely young. I don't know what the magic age was, but I'm fairly confident that I wasn't that age. We had more of a, if you can reach the pedals, you can drive it attitude on the farm. I also remember walking beans with my babysitter, many nights, usually till dark. And I don't want to call my dad cheap because he might be watching this, but that's certainly getting some bang for your buck. I also had the opportunity to watch my parents work extremely hard day after day on the farm. I attended college, and I was the first one to attend college in my family. Going to college for me was not a given. It was in college where I got my first exposure to law, having the ability to take some undergrad law classes. Those interested me enough that I applied for an internship at the AG's office, which I was lucky enough to get. And I primarily spent time working in the Sexually Violent Predator Division. I got to read about the horrible things that had been done to people. Many of those people were children. And I can still remember a lot of those scenarios, even if I don't remember their names. I remember what happened to them. I was tasked with compiling reports used by the committee to determine whether or not someone was going to be civilly committed after they had served their period of incarceration, because they were going to be deemed too harmful to be released in society. I think that's an experience that if some would have experienced, that would have pushed them away from law. But for whatever reason, that was the hook for me. I became more determined that I wanted to do something in the legal field. I attended law school. I had the opportunity to extern with a judge here in Polk County, and I also had the opportunity to work at a large firm here in Des Moines during the summer. It was at that point where I was faced with a decision on what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I decided to return to my hometown, a decision that I don't think many people would have made in my position. However, looking back on it, it was the best decision that I ever made. I got to write my first brief when I was studying for the bar exam, and I was able to file that brief the day I was admitted to the bar. I think that's an experience that not many can say they had. Also, I was given responsibility on my first full day as a lawyer that many lawyers in large firms wouldn't receive in the first 10 years of their practice. I had a general practice, whatever walked in the door or whoever called that day. It could be on a family law matter, a real estate matter, an estate matter, a contract matter, an adoption, you name it. Whatever came in the door was my responsibility. And I think you can see from my application, many of these matters were not simple matters. Many of these matters took years of litigation to resolve, and in some cases took several trips to Iowa's appellate courts to resolve. In doing all of this, it's taught me the importance of writing on a deadline and time management. Not only was I doing county attorney work, my private practice work, along with the office practice work, I was also representing real clients. And from time to time in cases, it was interesting, or I guess sometimes rewarding, to see how clients evolved throughout the case. Sometimes I was representing somebody who was single when we started the case, and by the end of the case, they were married with 3 kids and had moved to a different state. Also, in those circumstances, you also, generally speaking, are dealing with people who are going through probably the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their lives. And sometimes, not only are you being a lawyer, but in certain circumstances, you're being a friend to them and trying to just help them kind of get the wheels back on track. I've had the ability to handle many different cases in several of Iowa's districts. This has given me the understanding that procedurally things may work different in district court in Polk County versus how they would work in a more rural setting like Carroll County. Also, early on in my practice, I was introduced to what they refer to as the cattle call. It was very shocking to me when there was an order entered for a 1 o'clock hearing, and I showed up to the courthouse at 1 o'clock and the entire hallway was filled with attorneys and clients. Of course, as a young attorney, I was at the very end of the pecking order, so I got to see the judge at about 4:10 that day. I know the importance of making a good record, and from time to time in my cases, I would check with the court reporter to make sure that all the exhibits had been admitted that I thought were admitted, and from time to time realize that actually an exhibit hadn't been admitted. Also, probably one of the most humbling things that a lawyer can do is go back and read a transcript of some proceeding that they've been involved in, and I think I can speak for every attorney in the room that you would usually, I think you remember things that happened in that proceeding differently, and when you go back and read the record, you realize that maybe they didn't happen exactly the way that you thought they did. I'm also wary of blind spots. With my practice in having so many different matters, I fully understand that there are several areas of law that I don't fully understand, and it's one of the things in my practice that I've had to handle almost on a daily basis. I believe my resume stacks up with the other applicants. So let's go back to the initial question that I asked. So, Aaron, how do you know how to do all that? I think back to the lessons that I learned growing up on the farm. It propelled me to where I'm at, through law school, through college, and through my practice. And what I learned growing up on the farm is I wasn't necessarily being taught how to do any particular task. It was the skill set to figure out any problem and how to get things done. Grit, discipline, consistency, purpose, mixed in with a little bit of obsession, and an indifference to failure. I started that journey working on those skills well over 25 years ago. That's plenty of time to create the foundation needed for an Iowa appellate court judge. Thank you. Open it up to any questions anyone has.
Thank you. We'll start our questions with Commissioner Harkoff.
Aaron, it's good to see you. Thank you very much for applying for the vacancy. As we had our conversation, you went to Grandview University and you achieved your BA in finance with the highest honors. You also played golf at Grandview. Can you talk about the skills you obtained to be a good golfer, and are those kinds of skills transferable to being a good judge on the Court of Appeals?
Well, I think they can be. I don't know if there's many golfers in the room. I think from my interviews, there's a few here. But golf is a very humbling sport, and you're usually, playing against yourself most of the time. And I think it's something where you can never really reach perfection. You're always, continually trying to improve, even though you may never achieve actual, perfection in that. I think, that skill set, of course, kind of, the integrity that, you should have as a golfer, the ability to interact with different people on the golf course. You're kind of, in a sense, always at odds with yourself and trying to improve. I think those skills are transferable to a judge. I think, many times, obviously with the cases that judges hear, they're going to be facing, a fair amount of adversity, or at least the parties that are appearing before them have a fair amount of adversity. And I think it's helpful to kind of use those same skills and tools to kind of work through the problems that are being presented to the judges.
Commissioner Spees.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I know you've been on the Iowa Jury Instruction Committee since last year, and I don't know if there have been many issues that have been in front of you, but that's a great learning experience. And tell us what you've learned being on that committee.
I've learned there's a lot of smart people in the world. And it's been a great experience. I think we've met a few times, and actually, at least on the criminal side, there's been a few cases that have come down out of Iowa appellate courts that have been specifically directive on a few of our jury instructions. So we've, and sometimes it's even like, well, I think that instruction's okay, but here would maybe be a better way to do it. So then we as a committee have to sit there and figure out if that would actually be a better way to do it. And if there is a better way to do it, how do we actually word it that way? And I think, sometimes when you're dealing, with people on a committee like that, you get a lot of debate and a lot of different opinions on exactly what should be done, if anything. So I think that experience has been, really good in kind of getting other people's perspectives on, how the law, can be reflected in those instructions.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hansen.
Hello, good afternoon. If a case required you to learn about a specific industry or subject matter or law that you weren't familiar with, how would you go about doing that? Well,
the first thing is if I had a case, hopefully the lawyers appearing in front of me were somewhat experts in that in that area, and I could rely on their briefs, as a starting point to kind of get familiar with what's going on in the case. I think maybe one of the nice things as a judge is you don't have to solve the world's problems. You just need to solve the problems of the parties in front of you. So you're really just dealing with the issues that they're presenting to you. You don't need to go out and, canvass and find issues, for those parties. But reading those briefs and then reading some of the key cases, and finding some old cases from, court decisions, because they will usually cite to other authority that they're relying on. And reading that authority kind of gets you, up to speed, hopefully with the parties kind of adding in, some practical aspects of whatever industry or field that is. I think is a good way to get up to speed.
Sure, thank you.
Commissioner Stanger?
Thanks for applying, no questions.
Commissioner Picklett?
Yeah, Aaron, good to see you again. Aaron and I sit on 2B together, so we're going to run through a quick hypo here. And let's say you're sitting in this seat. You and I have had the benefit of vetting candidates to join the bench in our district. And let's say you're sitting here and examining somebody sitting at that microphone. Let's say you have to pick one or two attributes that you think that we should be focusing on. What are those? And then the second part of that question is how do you check those boxes?
Well, that's a good question. You never ask good questions like that.
Well played.
Let's see. I think one is curiosity. I think when you're a judge, you need to be curious and wanting to know more about the cases that are coming, before you. And two, I think is maybe hard to describe in a few words, but I think, having somewhat of a philosophy or an idea that what you're dealing with is going to affect not only the parties in that case, but has broader implications beyond just those parties. And I think having that perspective to kind of step back a little bit and kind of understand, maybe there will be some collateral consequences that arise out of a case, that are nice to kind of maybe keep in mind. And that may be something that the parties themselves are not necessarily focused on. But I think, those two things I think are really key attributes of any good judge.
Nice job, thanks.
Commissioner Semmelroth?
Yes. So as somebody who's been in private practice, while you haven't presided over trials, you've participated in trials, and I guess what I'm wondering is who are judicial role models that you would try to emulate if you were on the Court of Appeals?
Well, I could probably spend the rest of the time talking about that, but I'll maybe pick out one, which was a district court judge that I initially appeared in several times in Carroll County, and it was a local judge from Carroll County. And I was always, amazed by that judge at how much they knew about the case when I showed up to the courtroom. And in many instances, I always was trying to figure out what question they were going to ask me to stump me, because they always somehow knew more about it than I did. And I'm like, this is my case. Like, I'm supposed to be the expert. And you're asking me about some case from the Fifth Circuit somewhere that you think might have some application to this. But from what I take away from that, though, was that preparation, reading through everything and having a good understanding of what the issues are before the parties appear, so that in knowing what the issues are, you can ask good questions, to the attorneys and the parties and really get to the heart of the issues. And I think for me, a little bit when you're a practicing attorney, you're kind of trying to think like the judge. And, I've heard good judges kind of try to think like the lawyers a little bit. So I think, that would be something that I would keep in mind if I got this position.
Thank you.
Commissioner Roberts?
Aaron, you have good sort of balance in your practice, both in terms of subject matter and then trial experience and appellate experience. Are there particular pieces of your practice and your experience as a lawyer that you think will help you as a Court of Appeals judge, or is it like the sum of the parts instead?
Well, I think, having a broad background is very helpful, because obviously at the Court of Appeals, you're going to hear cases across the entire spectrum of law. Obviously, I think you can look at the statistics and you can see that family law and criminal law make up a large part of the Court of Appeals docket. And, I have, a fair amount of experience, in those areas, so I feel pretty comfortable in those areas, so I think that helps. And I think it helps to, I kind of look at it as a little bit of a larger scale. I mean, some of the skill set that you kind of need to figure out new problems that are presented to you can be directly applied to having, a case where maybe you're not as familiar with the law in that area, and kind of have the skill set to be able to figure out what's going on in that case.
Thanks.
Commissioner Schnur?
Aaron, quick question. One of the things that you mentioned in your remarks was being from Carroll, Iowa, having a rural practice, which may or may not be unique. But I want you to comment about that and how it might influence you on the Court of Appeals if you are appointed. Your experience in more of a rural area, in a rural practice.
I think for judges on the Court of Appeals, it's good to have a good mix because, as a Court of Appeals judge, you're sitting in panels and you're kind of relying on the collective experience to hopefully reach, good decisions in those cases. And I think my rural experience is maybe an experience that not many of the current Court of Appeals judges have, and maybe not many of the other applicants have. And I think, from that setting is you're just given so much more responsibility. I mean, day one, you're responsible for your firm, you're the HR of the department, you're the janitor. I mean, you wear all the hats. And, in rural, I think here, obviously in Polk County, people become more specialized, but in Carroll County, they see you as a lawyer, which means you know everything about everything, according to them. And I think that gives you kind of a perspective that it doesn't really work, exactly that way. I think, the lifestyle, obviously, in a rural area is a little different than in an urban area like Des Moines. So I think it just gives a little different perspective to things.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hoiting?
I have no questions, but thank you for applying, and I really appreciate all you've done out of Manning, Iowa, which is just awesome. So thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner Hoyk?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Parrish?
Thanks for applying. No questions. Thank you so much.
Commissioner Henderson?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Marquardt?
Okay, so thank you for your application. I'm going to break the streak of no questions. One of the things that's been suggested to us that we should look for is judicial independence. What does judicial independence look like to you, and how would you practice that if you were selected for the Court of Appeals position?
There's another question that could take a half hour to explain, but I'll do my best to keep it short. I think judicial independence is really important, and I think you could generally say over the last few years, some of that is starting to be called into question, or at least, there's some political advocates, pointing that it may not be what it once was. And I think for me, serving in a judge role to maintain or make sure that there is judicial independence is you're really just dealing with the information that's being presented to you by the parties and the litigants, and you're not, searching for any outside influence in that case. And you're also not driving a case in a particular direction that you think it should go. I think those are a couple things that are, important to keep in mind when you're sitting as a judge.
Commissioner Pearson?
No question.
Commissioner Chase?
Thank you. Aaron, thanks for your application. You mentioned discipline and consistency as two of the characteristics that you possess and from growing up in rural Iowa. How would those translate into good characteristics for someone on the Court of Appeals?
Well, kind of the elephant in the room with the Court of Appeals job is just the caseload that those judges have to work through. So I think, having the ability to have, discipline and consistency to probably have to move cases forward almost every single day. This isn't going to be a job that's 8 to 5 and then you go off and do whatever. It's going to probably require, late nights, weekends. And just having those skills to be able to kind of drive yourself forward and to get into the work, I think is key. And then to consistently, do that. And when you start doing that, you start building good habits, which, help with everything.
We have time for a quick one if you have one, Commissioner.
I do not, but thank you for your application.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr.
you.
Ahrendsen. We appreciate your application, and we wish you all the best.
Thanks.